They called him a curse, a demon child, an omen of death wrapped in skin the color of bone. For 8 years, Samuel stood on auction blocks across 3 states, and for 8 years, not a single bidder raised their hand. Masters would spit at his feet. Women would cross themselves and turn away. Children would point and whisper that looking into his pink eyes would steal your soul. He learned to keep his gaze down, his voice silent, his hope buried so deep he'd forgotten what it tasted like. But on a sweltering August morning in 1847, when the auctioneer's voice cracked with frustration and the crowd had already begun to disperse, one hand rose from the back of the gathering. It belonged to a woman nobody expected to be there at all, and what she would do in the days that followed would shake the foundations of everything that plantation had ever known. The child nobody wanted. The morning Samuel turned 8, he woke to the familiar sounds of the slave quarters stirring to life before dawn. But unlike the other children who would spend this day working alongside their mothers in the fields or their fathers in the stables, Samuel knew what awaited him. It was auction day again. The 4th time this year. He'd been born on the Thornhill Plantation in South Carolina, delivered on a night when lightning split the sky and thunder rolled like cannon fire. His mother, Esther, had labored for 14 hours, and when the midwife finally pulled him into the world, the old woman had screamed. Not with joy, but with terror. The baby's skin was white as fresh cotton, his hair like corn silk, and when he opened his eyes, they gleamed pink in the lamplight. "Devil child," the midwife had whispered, backing away. "That ain't natural. That ain't right." Master Thornhill had come to see for himself, his face twisting with disgust. Esther had begged him not to take her baby, clutching Samuel to her chest even as blood still soaked the straw beneath her. But Thornhill wanted nothing to do with the infant. Superstition ran deep in the South, and an albino slave was considered the worst kind of omen. Crops would fail, livestock would sicken, death would visit the plantation. For 2 years, Esther had hidden Samuel as best she could, keeping him in the darkest corners of the quarters, covering his telltale hair with cloth, teaching him to be invisible. But a child cannot remain hidden forever. When Master Thornhill's cotton harvest failed 2 years running, and his prized mare died giving birth, the whispers began in earnest. The white child was cursed. He had to go. Samuel barely remembered his mother now, though sometimes in dreams he could recall the melody of her humming, the warmth of her arms. She'd been sold off to a plantation in Georgia when he was 3, screaming his name as the wagon carried her away. He'd been too young to understand that he'd never see her again. Since then, he'd been passed from trader to trader, auction to auction, each one hoping to unload him onto someone desperate or foolish enough to buy. But no one ever was. Now, standing in line with 20 other slaves outside the auction house in Charleston, Samuel felt the familiar weight of shame settle over his thin shoulders. The other slaves avoided looking at him, as they always did. Some made signs against evil when they thought he wasn't watching. A woman near the front of the line clutched her rosary and muttered prayers. "Straighten up the traitor," Mr. Hutchins barked at Samuel, though his voice lacked real conviction. He knew this would be another wasted day, and for God's sake try not to look so damned peculiar. But there was no way for Samuel to look anything other than what he was. His skin, after years of careful avoidance of direct sunlight, remained ghostly pale, almost translucent in places where the blue of his veins showed through. His white hair, cropped short by the traders who found it unsettling, stood out like a beacon, and his eyes, those pink-tinged eyes that people said looked through you rather than at you, were impossible to hide. The auction began mid-morning. The Charleston block was one of the largest in the South, and the crowd that gathered was thick with planters, overseers, and merchants looking to acquire labor. The day was already brutal with heat, the kind of wet, suffocating warmth that made shirts cling to backs and tempers flare. One by one, the slaves were brought forward. Strong men with broad shoulders went for top dollar, their teeth examined, their muscles prodded like livestock. Women known for bearing healthy children commanded good prices. Even the children, those who looked capable of work, found buyers quickly. Then it was Samuel's turn. The moment he stepped onto the platform, the crowd's energy shifted. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. A few people gasped. Others laughed, though the laughter had a nervous edge to it. "What in the hell is that?" someone shouted from the crowd. That's the albino boy I told you about. Another voice responded. Been trying to sell him for years. Nobody'll touch him. The auctioneer, a red-faced man named Colby who'd been doing this work for 3 decades, cleared his throat uncomfortably. He'd presided over Samuel's failed auctions twice before and knew what was coming. This here is Samuel, Colby began, his voice lacking its usual enthusiasm. Strong boy, healthy, good with animals. He's cursed. A woman in the front row interrupted, her voice shrill with fear. Everyone knows an albino brings nothing but misfortune. He's got devil eyes, another man added, making the sign of the cross. I heard he killed 3 men just by looking at them. That ain't true, Colby protested weakly, but the damage was done. The crowd was already backing away, as if Samuel carried plague. Samuel stood perfectly still, his hands clasped in front of him, his gaze fixed on a spot on the wooden platform. He'd learned years ago that meeting anyone's eyes only made things worse. He could feel their revulsion like a physical thing, pressing against him from all sides. Starting bid at $50, Colby called out, though his voice carried no hope. $50 for a young, healthy boy. Anyone? 25? Will anyone give me 25? Silence, complete and absolute. Samuel felt something crack inside his chest. Though he kept his face carefully blank, he was used to this rejection, but somehow it never hurt any less. He was 8 years old, and in that moment, standing on that platform under the merciless southern sun, he felt ancient with grief. $10? Colby tried, desperation creeping into his voice now. Sue, rely someone needs a field hand for $10. I wouldn't take him for free, someone shouted, and several people laughed. He'll curse your land. Your cattle will die. Send him back where he came from. The calls grew louder, meaner. Someone threw a rotten tomato that splattered near Samuel's feet. The crowd was turning ugly now, the way crowds sometimes did when confronted with something they couldn't understand, something that frightened them. Colby raised his hands, trying to restore order. Now, folks, let's be civilized about get that devil child off the stage. Samuel's breathing had become shallow. His hands trembled slightly, though he willed them to be still. He wanted to run, to disappear, to cease existing entirely. Maybe they were right. Maybe he was cursed. Maybe the world would be better if he'd never been born at all. Just as Colby was about to give up and wave Samuel off the platform, a voice cut through the chaos. I'll bid $20. The crowd fell silent instantly, heads swiveling to locate the speaker. Samuel risked a glance up. At the back of the crowd stood a woman. She was perhaps 40, dressed in a simple gray dress that marked her as neither wealthy nor poor. Her dark hair was pulled back severely from a face that might have been pretty once, but was now lined with what looked like years of hard living. She held herself with a strange dignity, her chin raised, her eyes steady as they met the shocked stares of those around her. Did you say $20, ma'am? Colby asked, his voice thick with disbelief. I did. The woman's voice was firm, carrying a slight accent Samuel couldn't place. Northern, maybe, or Forai. GN. $20 for the boy. Ma'am, I don't think you understand, a portly gentleman beside her said, his tone patronizing. That child is an albino. They're bad luck. Wherever he goes, misfortune follows. Your crops will fail, your animals will sicken. My crops have already failed, the woman said calmly. I've had 3 bad harvests in a row. My animals are already sickening. My husband is dead, and I'm about to lose my land to the bank. I don't see how this child could make my situation any worse. She stepped forward, moving through the crowd with purpose. People parted for her, some muttering, others simply staring in disbelief. You're Mrs. Catherine Brennan, aren't you? Someone in the crowd asked. From the old Brennan place up north of here? I am. Your husband died just 3 months ago, didn't he? Fell from his horse? He did. And now you're buying a cursed slave. The man's voice was incredulous. Woman, have you lost your mind with grief? Catherine Brennan stopped a few feet from the auction platform and looked directly at Samuel for the first time. Her eyes were gray, the color of clouds before rain. And when she looked at him, something impossible happened. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She didn't make the sign of the cross or mutter a prayer. She simply saw him, Going once for $20 to Mrs. Brennan, Colby said quickly, before anyone could talk her out of it. Going twice. Sold. He brought his gavel down with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. Samuel felt dizzy. In 8 years, this was the first time anyone had bid on him, the first time anyone had wanted him, even for the paltry sum of $20. As the crowd began to disperse, still muttering and shaking their heads, Catherine Brennan approached the platform. Up close, Samuel could see that her gray eyes were kind but sad, carrying a weight he recognized. It was the look of someone who'd lost something precious and knew they'd never get it back. "Hello, Samuel," she said quietly. "My name is Catherine. Can you ride a horse?" The question was so unexpected that Samuel forgot his training and looked directly at her. "Yes, ma'am," he whispered. His voice was rusty from disuse. The traders rarely spoke to him, and the other slaves were too frightened. "Good. It's a long ride to my farm." She turned to Hutchins, who was hurrying over with the papers. "I'll pay you now." Money changed hands. Papers were signed, and just like that, after 8 years of rejection, Samuel belonged to someone. As Catherine led him through the streets of Charleston toward where her horse and wagon waited, Samuel kept expecting her to change her mind, to realize what she'd done and demand her money back. But she walked with steady purpose, occasionally glancing back to make sure he was keeping up. "You're probably wondering why I bought you," Catherine said as they reached a weathered wagon hitched to a tired-looking mare. Samuel didn't respond. He'd learned that sometimes silence was safer than speech. "The truth is," Catherine continued, climbing into the wagon and gesturing for Samuel to join her, "I'm out of options. The bank is going to foreclose on my property in 2 months unless I can bring in a harvest. I can't afford healthy slaves. I can't afford much of anything anymore." She snapped the reins, and the wagon lurched for R&D. "But I figured $20 for help, cursed or not, was better than giving up entirely." She fell silent after that, guiding the wagon through the crowded streets and eventually out onto the open road leading north. Samuel sat beside her, his thin body swaying with the wagon's movement, trying to process what had happened. He'd been bought, actually bought, by a woman who seemed neither cruel nor kind, just desperately practical. As the sun climbed higher and the city fell away behind them, Samuel allowed himself the smallest flicker of something he'd thought dead inside him. Not hope exactly. Hope was too dangerous, but perhaps curiosity, a wondering about what came next. The Brennan farm, when they finally reached it hours later, was not what Samuel had expected. He'd been on plantations before, grand estates with white-columned mansions and hundreds of acres. The Brennan place was modest to the point of poverty. The house was a simple 2-story structure that had once been white but was now gray with age and neglect. The barn leaned slightly to one side. Fences needed mending. Fields that should have been green with crops stood brown and struggling. "It wasn't always like this," Catherine said, as if reading his thoughts. She climbed down from the wagon stiffly, her movements suggesting bone-deep exhaustion. "My husband, John, he was a good farmer. We had decent harvests, enough to get by. But 3 years ago, things started going wrong. Drought one year, flooding the next, then blight. He worked himself to death trying to save this place." Her voice cracked slightly. "Literally worked himself to death." She led Samuel toward the house. "There's a room of the kitchen where you'll sleep. It's small but dry. You'll take your meals with me. I can't afford to feed you much, but you won't starve." They were met at the door by the only other person on the property, an elderly black woman named Ruth, who served as cook and housekeeper. Ruth took one look at Samuel and her eyes went wide. "Miss Catherine," she said slowly, "what in the Lord's name have you brought home?" "Help," Catherine replied simply. "Ruth, this is Samuel." "Samuel, this is Ruth. She'll show you where things are." Ruth continued to stare at Samuel with a mixture of fear and pity. "Child," she said finally, "you sure are a peculiar-looking thing. Your mama know you out here?" "He doesn't have a mother," Catherine said sharply, "and I'll thank you not to make him feel more unwelcome than he already does. He's here to work, same as you." Ruth muttered something under her breath but nodded. "Follow me then, ghost child." The room Catherine had mentioned was indeed small, barely large enough for the narrow cot and wooden chest it contained, but it had a window that looked out on the fields. and the cot had actual blankets. After years of sleeping on bare ground or in cramped slave quarters where he was shunned to the farthest corner, it felt almost luxurious. That night, Samuel lay awake on his cot, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house settling around him. Through the thin walls he could hear Catherine moving about, her footsteps heavy and slow. Once he thought he heard her crying, though the sound was quickly muffled. He touched the blanket carefully, almost reverently. It was rough wool, worn thin in places, but it was his. For however long his lasted, it was his. And that woman, Catherine Brennan, had looked at him without fear, had spoken to him like he was a person, not a curse. Samuel didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He didn't know if the farm would fail or if Catherine would come to regret buying him. He didn't know if Ruth would warm to him or if the neighboring farmers would cause trouble. But tonight, for the first time in 8 years, he was not standing on an auction block being rejected. He was not being passed from trader to trader like unwanted cargo. Tonight he belonged somewhere. It wasn't much. But for a boy who'd had nothing, it felt like everything. The unexpected harvest. The rooster's crow woke Samuel before dawn. For a moment he forgot where he was, his heart hammering with the old panic of wondering which trader's wagon he'd be sleeping in, which auction block awaited him. Then he felt the blanket beneath his fingers, saw the pale light filtering through his window, and remembered. The Brennan farm. Catherine. Ruth. He dressed quickly in the rough clothes Catherine had left for him and made his way to the kitchen, where Ruth was already stoking the fire in the stove. "Morning," Samuel ventured quietly. Ruth jumped slightly, pressing a hand to her chest. "Lord have mercy, boy, you move like a ghost. Don't be creeping up on people like that." "Sorry, ma'am." Ruth studied him in the growing light, her expression softening slightly. "You had breakfast yet?" "No, ma'am." "Well, sit yourself. Down. I got cornmeal mush and a bit of molasses. Ain't much, but it'll stick to your ribs." As Samuel ate, Ruth moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, preparing a tray. "For Catherine. Ms. Catherine, she don't sleep well no more," Ruth said, more to herself than to Samuel. "Not since Master John died. Sometimes I hear her walking the house at 3 in the morning, just walking and walking like she trying to outpace her grief." Catherine appeared in the doorway, looking as tired as Ruth had described. Her hair was already pinned up, and she wore men's work clothes, pants and a shirt that had probably belonged to her husband. "Samuel," she said without preamble, "can you really work with animals, or was that auctioneer lying?" "I can work with them, ma'am. Had to tend the horses and mules at the Thornhill place when I was little." "Good. We've got one mare, Daisy, and she's about ready to foal. I need you to watch her today, make sure nothing goes wrong. Ruth will show you where the barn is." "Yes, ma'am." "And Samuel?" Catherine's gray eyes fixed on him. "If you see anyone coming down the road, anyone at all, you come get me immediately. Understand?" "Yes, ma'am." After Catherine left to work in the fields, Ruth walked Samuel out to the barn. "She's worried about the neighbors," Ruth explained. "Word's going to spread that she bought you, and folks around here are, well, they're particular about things. Superstitious. You being what you are, there's going to be talk." The barn was dim and smelled of hay and horse. Daisy, a gentle brown mare with a swollen belly, nickered softly when they entered. "She's a sweet one," Ruth said, patting the horse's neck. "Master John loved this horse. Said she was the finest he ever owned. The baby she carrying, that's from his prize stallion before it died last winter. Miss Catherine, she's enting on that foal, counting on being able to sell it to help pay the bank." Samuel approached Daisy carefully, letting her smell his hand. The mare didn't flinch from him the way people did. Animals never seemed to care that he looked different. Daisy nuzzled his palm, and Samuel felt something ease in his chest. "I'll take good care of her," he promised. "See that you do," Ruth said. "And Samuel, whatever folks say about you, whatever they think you are, you remember something. The Lord don't make mistakes. You hear me? You here for a reason, even if we don't know what it is yet." The old woman left him then, and Samuel spent the morning in the barn with Daisy. He checked her water, freshened her hay, and talked to her in soft whispers the way he'd seen the old, stable hands do back at Thornhill. Daisy seemed to appreciate the company, resting her large head against his shoulder with a contented sigh. Around midday, Samuel heard the sound of approaching horses. He remembered Catherine's instructions and ran to find her in the fields. She was bent over a struggling row of tobacco plants, her hands caked with dirt, her face flushed with heat and frustration. When she saw Samuel running, she straightened immediately. "Someone coming?" "Yes, ma'am. 4 horses." Catherine's jaw tightened. "Get back to the barn and stay there. No matter what you hear, don't come out." Samuel obeyed, though his curiosity burned. From the barn's small window, he watched as 4 men on horseback rode into the yard. They were all well-dressed, planters, their horses fine and well-fed. Samuel recognized the type immediately, men of property and influence. Catherine walked out to meet the M, wiping her hands on her pants. Even from a distance, Samuel could see the tension in her shoulders. "Mrs. Brennan," the lead rider said, dismounting. He was a heavy man with mutton-chop sideburns and a voice that carried. "I'm Thomas Waverly from the Waverly Plantation, 5 miles east. These gentlemen are my neighbors and associates." "Mr. Waverly," Catherine replied, her voice neutral. "What can I do for you?" "We heard something concerning Mrs. Brennan. Heard you purchased an albino slave at yesterday's auction in Charleston." "I purchased a worker, yes. Ma'am, with all due respect, that was a foolish decision. Albinos are cursed. Everyone knows this. That boy will bring nothing but trouble to your land, and worse, his presence here puts all our properties at risk." Catherine crossed her arms. "How exactly does an 8-year-old child put your property at risk, Mr. Waverly?" "Curses spread, Mrs. Brennan. Misfortune is contagious. Your crops are already failing. Your husband is dead. Do you really want to make things worse?" "My husband died in a riding accident," Catherine said, her voice hard. "My crops are failing because we've had 3 years of terrible weather, same as everyone else in this region. That has nothing to do with a child." Another man spoke up, younger than Waverly but with the same air of authority. "Mrs. Brennan, we're here as neighbors, trying to help. We're prepared to make you an offer. We'll buy that albino from you for $30, 10% more than you paid. That's a good profit for 1 day's ownership. He's not for sale." "Ma'am, please be reasonable. I said he's not for sale." Catherine's voice could have cut glass. "And I'll thank you, gentlemen, to leave my property now." Waverly's face reddened. "You're making a mistake, Mrs. Brennan. A widow woman alone. No slaves but that cursed boy and old Ruth, barely scraping by. You need friends in this county. You need people willing to help you. This stubbornness won't serve you well. Is that a threat, Mr. Waverly?" "It's a warning. Natural consequences, you might say. People won't want to trade with you, won't want to associate with you. Not while you harbor that devil child. You'll find yourself even more alone than you already are." Catherine stepped forward, and despite being a foot shorter than Waverly, she somehow made him take a step back. "My husband and I came to South Carolina 15 years ago from Pennsylvania. Do you know why we left, Mr. Waverly? Because we didn't believe in slavery. We thought it was an abomination, a sin against God and nature. But John wanted to farm, and you can't farm in the South without participating in the system, so we compromised our principles. We bought Ruth because the previous owner was going to sell her south to the cotton fields, and she was already 50 years old. We tried to make the best of a bad situation." Her voice grew stronger. "My husband is dead. My dreams are dead. This farm is dying. I've compromised everything I believed in, and I have nothing to show for it. But I'll be damned if I'm going to send that child back to the auction block to be rejected and humiliated again just because you and your associates are superstitious fools." The silence that followed was absolute. The 4 men stared at Catherine as if she'd grown a second head. Finally, Waverly found his voice. "You'll regret this, Mrs. Brennan." "I regret many things, Mr. Waverly. This won't be one of them." The men mounted their horses and rode off, but not before Waverly called back. "When that curse brings ruin to your door, don't come crying to us for help." Catherine stood in the yard until they were out of sight, then seemed to deflate, her shoulders sagging. She pressed her hands to her face, and Samuel saw them trembling. He slipped out of the barn quietly. "Ma'am?" Catherine looked up, startled. "I thought I told you to stay in the barn." "You did, ma'am, but you looked like you might need—" He trailed off, unsure how to finish. "Like I might need what?" Her voice was gentler than he expected. "Like you might need to know somebody's on your side." Catherine's eyes glistened with sudden tears. She blinked them back furiously. You heard all that? Yes, ma'am. And you know what it means? I've just made enemies of the most powerful men in the county. They'll make good on their threats. No one will trade with us. No one will help us if we need it. I know, ma'am. This is all for you. An 8-year-old boy I don't even know. It's madness. My husband would have thought me completely mad. Samuel looked at the ground. I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't mean to cause you trouble. If you want to sell me, I understand. No. The word came out sharp and definitive. No, Samuel. Do you know what I saw yesterday when I looked at you on that auction block? He shook his head. I saw my son. Samuel's head jerked up in surprise. Catherine's voice was thick with emotion now. John and I had a son, William. He was born with a club foot, twisted and wrong. The doctors said He'd never walk properly. We didn't care. He was our boy, and we loved him. But the neighbors, they whispered. They said it was God's punishment for our abolitionist views. They said William was cursed, that we should put him in an institution and forget about him. She wiped at her eyes. He died 2 years ago. Fever. He was only 6 years old. And standing there yesterday, watching you on that platform, watching all those people reject you and call you cursed and treat you like you weren't even human. I saw William. I saw what his life would have been like if we'd listened to those people. And I just couldn't walk away. Samuel felt something break open in his chest. I'm not your son, ma'am. I know that. But maybe you can be something. Someone who deserves a chance. Someone who gets to be seen as a person instead of a curse. She straightened, squaring her shoulders. Come on. We've got work to do. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Samuel's life, but also the strangest and most wonderful. Catherine worked him from dawn to dusk, teaching him everything about running a farm. He learned to repair fences, to recognize which plants were diseased, to coax struggling crops to grow. His skin, so unused to sunlight, burned painfully at first, until Catherine fashioned him a wide-brimmed hat and insisted he wear long sleeves despite the heat. The sun'll kill you quicker than any curse, she said matter-of-factly. True to Waverley's word, the neighbors shunned them completely. When Catherine took crops to market, people refused to buy from her. When she needed supplies, merchants claimed to be out of stock. The isolation was total and deliberate. But something unexpected happened. The farm began to improve. It started small. A row of tobacco that had been struggling suddenly began to thrive. Tomatoes that had been withering on the vine grew plump and red. Catherine's small vegetable garden, which had produced almost nothing for 2 years, suddenly exploded with abundance. Don't tell me this is coincidence, Ruth said one morning, surveying baskets overflowing with produce. That child been here 3 weeks, and suddenly everything growing like we got Eden in the backyard. Catherine frowned. The weather's been better, more rain. There ain't been more rain, there been less rain, but somehow our well never runs dry while the neighbors complaining their well's running low. Samuel tried to stay invisible, afraid that if anyone paid too much attention to the changes, they'd realize it was somehow his fault and send him away. But he couldn't deny what he was seeing. The plants seemed to respond to him, growing stronger wherever he worked. The animals were healthier. Even Daisy, the pregnant mare, seemed calmer and more content when he was near. One evening, Samuel found Catherine in the barn, staring at Daisy with an expression of wonder. The mare had just given birth to a perfect colt, strong and healthy with a coat like polished mahogany. I've never seen a finer foal, Catherine whispered. This colt could sell for $200, maybe more, enough to pay the bank and keep us going another year. The neighbors won't buy from you, Samuel reminded her quietly. Catherine smiled, and it was the first real smile he'd seen from her. Then I'll travel to Columbia and sell him there. The hell with the neighbors. But news of the miraculous colt spread quickly, and with it a shift in the local attitude. If the albino boy was cursed, people whispered, why was the Brennan farm suddenly thriving? Why were their crops the only ones not failing in the drought that had settled over the region? Thomas Waverley arrived again one morning, this time alone and with a different demeanor. Mrs. Brennan, he said, hat in hand, I may have been hasty in my judgment. Catherine, who'd been weeding the garden with Samuel, stood slowly. Is that so? My tobacco is dying, all of it. But I noticed your fields are green and healthy. And I heard about that colt. He cleared his throat awkwardly. I was wondering if you might be willing to, that is, if the boy might be willing to come look at my fields, just for a day or two. I'd pay you, of course. Catherine looked at Samuel, then back at Waverly. You called him a devil child. You threatened to isolate me unless I got rid of him. Now you want his help? I was wrong, Waverly said, the admission clearly painful. We all were. Please, Mrs. Brennan. My family's livelihood depends on this harvest. Catherine was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, Samuel, what do you think? Would you be willing to help Mr. Waverly? It was the first time anyone had asked Samuel what he wanted. He looked at the man who'd called him cursed, who'd tried to force Catherine to sell him, and felt the old anger and hurt rise up. But he also saw desperation in Waverly's eyes, the same desperation he'd seen in Catherine's when she'd bought him. I'll help, Samuel said quietly. But only if you apologize. Waverly's face reddened, but he looked Samuel in the eye and said, I apologize. I was wrong about you, dead wrong. Samuel spent 3 days at the Waverly Plantation. He walked the fields, touching the struggling plants, and within days they began to recover. He tended to sick livestock, and they improved. By the time he returned to the Brennan farm, Waverly was telling everyone who'd listened that the albino boy wasn't cursed at all. He was blessed. More neighbors came after that, sheepish and desperate. Catherine charged them all handsomely for Samuel's help, and the money she earned meant the bank could be paid off with enough left over to make real improvements to the farm. But with the changing fortunes came new dangers. One night, Samuel woke to the sound of horses and saw torches through his window. A group of men, strangers from another county, had come to kidnap him. They'd heard about the miracle albino and thought they could steal him and profit from his abilities. They hadn't counted on Catherine Brennan. She met them in the yard with her late husband's rifle. This child is under my protection, she said, her voice deadly calm. You'll leave my property now, or I'll shoot you for trespassing. That boy's worth a fortune, one of the men argued. You can't keep him all to yourself. He's not property to be bought and sold based on what he's worth. He's a human being. And he stays here. The standoff ended when Ruth appeared behind Catherine with a shotgun, followed by Waverly and 3 other neighbors who'd seen the torches and come to investigate. Mrs. Brennan's right, Waverly said. The boy stays here. And if any of you try this again, you'll answer to all of us, the would-be kidden. Appers left, but the incident changed something in Samuel. He realized that even good fortune could make him a target, that being valued for his abilities was just another form of being seen as different, as other. That night, he sat with Catherine on the porch, watching the stars. Are you afraid? She asked. Sometimes, he admitted. People wanted to get rid of me when they thought I was cursed. Now they want to steal me because they think I'm blessed. Either way, nobody sees me. They just see what they think I can do for them. Catherine was quiet for a moment. Do you know what I see when I look at you? No, ma'am. I see a boy who survived things that would have broken most adults. I see someone who works harder than anyone I've ever met because he spent his whole life trying to prove he deserves to exist. I see kindness in how you treat the animals, gentleness in how you handle the plants. I see my son's courage and my husband's integrity. She turned to look at him. I see Samuel, just Samuel, and that's enough. For the first time in his life, Samuel felt tears on his cheeks. He didn't try to hide them. I know I can't replace William, he said quietly, but I'm grateful you gave me a chance when nobody else would. Catherine put her arm around his shoulders, and Samuel leaned into the embrace. You don't have to replace anyone. You just have to be yourself. The harvest that year was the finest the region had seen in a decade. The Brennan farm, once on the edge of ruin, became profitable again. Catherine paid off the bank, repaired the house and barn, and even hired 2 more workers, a young couple who'd been sold separately and whom Catherine reunited, much to Ruth's joy at having more company. Samuel grew taller, stronger, his confidence building with each passing season. The neighbors who'd once called him cursed now greeted him respectfully. Children who'd been taught to fear him learned to wave when he passed. The local minister, after much prayer and contemplation, declared that perhaps God worked in mysterious ways and that judging based on appearance was itself a sin. But the greatest change was in Samuel himself. He began to understand that he wasn't cursed or blessed. He was simply different, and different didn't have to mean less. The plants responded to him because he paid attention to them. cared for them in ways others didn't. The animals trusted him because he was gentle and patient. His success wasn't magic or miracle. It was hard work combined with compassion. On his 12th birthday, Catherine did something unprecedented. She called Samuel into the study where she kept the farm's records and closed the door. "Samuel, I've been thinking about the future," she said. "I'm not getting any younger, and this farm will need someone to run it when I'm gone. Ma'am, you've got years yet. Hush and let me finish." She smiled. "I've spoken to a lawyer in Colombia. It's complicated and it might not hold up if challenged, but I'm working on drawing up papers that would give you your freedom. And more than that, that would make you my heir." Samuel stared at her, unable to speak. "You've saved this farm, Samuel. You've saved me. The least I can do is make sure you have a future, a real future, not as someone's property, but as a free man with property of your own. But I know what you are. You're smart and hardworking and kind. You're the son I lost and the partner I needed. You're the best decision I ever made." Her voice grew fierce. "And I'll fight anyone, everyone, to make sure you get the life you deserve." The papers Catherine drew up did face challenges. Some neighbors objected. Some officials refused to process them. But Catherine was relentless, and she had allies now. Waverly and others who'd benefited from Samuel's help stood with her. The fight took years, but Catherine never wavered. When Samuel was 18, two things happened. First, the papers granting him his freedom were finally officially recognized. Second, Catherine fell ill with pneumonia. Samuel nursed her for 3 weeks, just as she'd once cared for him when he'd suffered terrible sunburn those first months on the farm. Ruth helped, and the neighbors came by with food and prayers. But Catherine was tired, worn down by years of hard work and harder fighting. On a cool October evening, with Samuel holding her hand, Catherine Brennan died. She left him everything: the farm, the livestock, the savings she'd carefully accumulated. But more than that, she left him a legacy. She'd shown him, and everyone who'd witnessed their story, that humanity wasn't determined by the color of one's skin or the strangeness of one's appearance, that curses and blessings were often just other names for the cruelty or kindness of people's hearts. Samuel buried Catherine next to her husband and son, planting a garden over their graves that bloomed year-round no matter the season. He ran the farm as she'd taught him, treating his workers with the same fairness and respect she'd shown. He never married. The laws and social customs of the time made that nearly impossible, but he created a family nonetheless, taking in those who'd been rejected by others, giving chances to those whom the world had deemed unworthy. Years later, when people asked him about his life, about the woman who'd changed everything, Samuel would say simply, "She saw me when I was invisible. She valued me when I was worthless. She loved me when I was unlovable. And in doing so, she taught me that the greatest curse is indifference, and the greatest blessing is being truly seen." The farm thrived for decades under Samuel's care, becoming known throughout the region not for the color of its owner's skin, but for the quality of its harvest and the fairness of its master. And though the world around him remained unjust, though slavery continued and prejudice persisted, Samuel's small corner of it stood as proof that one person's courage to look past fear, one person's willingness to see another's humanity, could change not just one life but generations. Because Catherine Brennan hadn't just saved an albino slave child from the auction block that August day in 1847, she'd saved herself from the worst kind of death, the death of hope, compassion, and the belief that one person could make a difference. And in doing so, she'd proven that the hands that rose from the back of that crowd, the hands that bid $20 when everyone else had turned away, weren't just buying a worker. They were writing a new story. One where curses could be broken, not by magic, but by the simple, radical act of choosing to see someone else's worth. That story lived on long after both Catherine and Sam were gone, passed down through the workers who'd found refuge on their farm, through the neighbors who'd witnessed the transformation, through the children who learned that different didn't mean less. And somewhere, on a small farm in South Carolina, flowers still bloomed over 3 graves. A man who'd worked himself to death trying to save his land, a woman who'd fought the world to save a child, and a boy with skin like bone and eyes like sunset who'd saved them both by simply surviving, and then by choosing to thrive. The story of Samuel and Catherine became legend in those parts, a reminder that in the darkest times, when hatred and fear seemed to rule the world, there were still people who would choose differently, who would reach out instead of turning away, who would see the human instead of the curse. And that, perhaps, was the greatest blessing of all.